DaviePHD's Mythbusters, Episode 4, 17th August 2020. Many things are said about various issues surrounding Scotland, our relationship with the UK, the European Union, independence, etc. So in these videos I'm going to bust the myths that many people believe. This week is going to be slightly different. I'm going to cover a subject which isn't really seen as an independence issue, but I think it really illustrates the political divergence between Scotland and our UK. This week's myth is the one that asylum seekers crossing the English Channel are entering the UK illegally and are just after a UK benefits check. Now, we all want to live in a country with secure borders, keeping us safe for terrorism and crime. And we all want to live in a country where people who settle here have done so legally, properly, and through their own choices. But singling out people so desperate to get here that they would risk crossing one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, in some cases with their children, on cheap inflatable kayaks, is not the answer. And neither the EU or France is to blame for the problem. There is no doubt that this border is being very poorly controlled. But there have recently been much bigger border issues in the UK that no one in the UK government even attempted to do anything about for 93 days. And even now, they've still only done half a job. The UK government are about to introduce even more porosity to our borders as part of a Brexit plan, with much more scope for exploitation than a few dinghies landing in Kent. I'm afraid the attempt to conflate this issue with France and the European Union is an illusion, successfully used by the Leave side of the Brexit debate to leverage support. Added to which, the criminal gangs assisting these people don't care one iota whether the UK is in the EU or not, whether they're customers or economic migrants or asylum seekers. To them, the English Channel is a revenue stream. Nothing more, nothing less. And you've been deceived if you thought Brexit was going to change a single thing on this issue. In the past, as part of the European Union, and even now, during the transition period, the UK is party to the Dublin Agreement. One of the things that means is that if a UK patrol vessel picked up some people in the Channel, they would have the option of taking them to France to land them if they were closer to France than the UK. But that option ends at the close of the EU transition period. Our vessels would then need permission to enter French waters, and they certainly won't get it if their intent is just to drop off a few asylum seekers back in France. Added to which, France is under no obligation to prevent people from leaving their country by whichever means, unless they're escaping criminal prosecution or punishment. After all, the English Channel is, right now, in geopolitical terms, nothing more than an internal EU border, which is worthy of no more consideration in EU terms than the one between France and Spain. Added to which, it's often the UK's failed foreign policies that have led to the situation where people are displaced and head to Europe and the UK. Think the Iraq War, half-arsed interventions in Libya, Syria, or continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia and its effect on neighbouring Yemen, just to name a few. On whether or not it's a crime, well, illegal immigration is, absolutely. But the International Refugee Convention of 1951 negates any immigration laws broken if the refugee immediately presents himself to the authorities and seeks asylum. Additionally, the benefits and housing offered here are actually less generous than most mainland European nations. Asylum processors are more compassionate and lenient in Germany, for example. So why do they come here? Well, there are two main reasons. Usually they have family connections. And the second reason is language. English is the most spoken second language in the world, mainly because it is widely spoken in the most prosperous countries in the world. Hence, many people in this situation try to make it to an English-speaking country, as it's easier to find work and assimilate. Australia and the USA hold the same attraction to asylum seekers and illicit immigrants. Now, asylum seeking and illegal or illicit immigration happens all over the world. Now, we can't morally sit here in the UK pontificating that it's all the EU's fault, while simultaneously being appalled watching the television with Donald Trump shouting about building a wall between the US and Mexico. We can all remember the outpouring of grief just last October when 39 Vietnamese people were found dead in a freezer trailer in Essex. We felt desperately sorry for them. We directed our anger towards a trafficking gang who'd organised their passage to the UK, and rightly so. But let's rewind the clock a wee bit there and imagine a different scenario. Let's imagine they'd been successful and they'd survived the trip. Those 39 people would have been let out of that trailer and disappeared into the night as full-blown illegal immigrants. If any of those people had showed up on one of those UK Border Force television shows, caught working illegally in, say, a takeaway kitchen somewhere, people would have booed at the television and rooted for the UK Border Force as the poor people were led away to be deported. The cold hard fact is, most people in this country only had compassion for the truck migrants because they'd failed, and crucially, they were dead. Now, I don't understand why, if someone successfully arrived in a little rubber boat, survived the attempt and legally claimed asylum, that our compassion for their situation should suddenly disappear. I mean, what does that say about the UK? One of the people who died in the truck in Essex paid a trafficking gang the equivalent of 10 years' average salary to be trafficked to the UK. So that's like a British person paying £280,000 to be smuggled to another country. Can you imagine how crap life would have to be in the UK for you to pay £280,000 to be smuggled out? Even going down the scales, trafficking gangs are charging £100 per person for a dinghy. Now that's a month's salary per person for most making the journey. Can you imagine how crap things would have to be for you to even consider putting your family in a rubber kayak to row across the channel, let alone handing over a month's salary for each person for the opportunity? And finally, can you imagine, after all that time, expense, planning and investment, how it must feel to have a claim refused and be told you're being sent back? The attempt to connect this problem to the European Union, though very successful, actually has zero basis in fact. In the Dublin Agreement, each country is responsible for looking after their own section of the EU coastline, and we're an island. The porosity of our borders is our fault. It's not the fault of the EU, the France, or the poor people trying to exploit that porosity. Human trafficking gangs are no respecters of political decisions. They don't care if we're in the European Union or not. They don't even care if their customers are migrants or asylum seekers, and they certainly don't care if they make it across alive. The only thing they care about is getting paid. If there was a demand for people to try to smuggle themselves into North Korea, a gang would spring up and facilitate it and profit from it. This issue is about UK border control, or lack thereof. Purely and simply, the UK has absolutely shocking levels of border control, and it's only going to get worse. During the COVID pandemic, it took 93 days to impose any kind of isolation requirements on arriving international travellers. During that time, 1.3 million people arrived through Heathrow Airport alone, with no health checks or questionnaires, no testing offered, and no requirement to self-isolate. Added to which, the post-Brexit plan for customs checking trucks enter the country is for them to drive 25 miles on public roads to a centre where customs checks will take place. Now, that's going to become 25 miles of bandit country. Drugs, cigarettes, weapons, people are going to come pouring in. Added to which, this master plan is forecast to cost £15 billion a year, every year. Interesting fact, that alone is £1.6 billion more than our EU membership fee was, some of which was actually reinvested in the UK. So it's clear we've got much bigger border issues to deal with than asylum seekers arriving in dinghies. The narrative that tries to blame the migrants themselves for their predicament is shameful and untrue. Wrongly labelling them migrants is the start of it. You'd really think that the government, especially the Home Secretary, the very minister most directly responsible, Priti Patel, would know the difference between an asylum seeker and an illegal immigrant. The fact that it fell to an ice cream manufacturer, Ben & Jerry's, to remind her that refugees are not illegal immigrants, that a faceless corporation has more compassion than our government, tells us all we need to know. James Cleverly MP was quick to attack them for their compassion, tweeting that he'd like a large scoop of statistically inaccurate virtue signalling with his grossly overpriced ice cream. But perhaps he'd forgotten that his own mother entered the UK as a refugee from Sierra Leone. Or perhaps he hoped that none of us would care enough to know. Yes, without the 1951 International Refugee Convention, Mr. Cleverly would have been brought up in very different circumstances, wouldn't he? Perhaps a victim of the long, bloody civil war, or suffering a horrid death in the Ebola pandemic of 2014. But no, here he is, an MP, chairman of the Conservative Party, all because his mother was a refugee. Ben & Jerry's may have used some dodgy statistics, but at least they have some virtue left to signal with, unlike James Cleverly and his colleagues. The simple fact is migrants, whichever type, prefer to enter countries with weak borders. And why wouldn't they? Why would they attempt to enter a fortress when there's a house with an open door over here and all they want is shelter? UK border control is shockingly bad, and it's only going to get more expensive and worse once we exit the EU transition period. But there is an alternative. It is, of course, independence. Contrast the hostility that asylum seekers are met with in our UK with the experience of a Lebanese refugee who was sent to Butte a few years ago. He was met at the airport with gifts from locals, given a lift to his accommodation, welcomed into the community, invited round for meals, and when it was legal, he was given a job. Once his claim had been processed, he opened a barber shop. Now has a branch in Glasgow too. I read his blog and he said he'd never felt his home as much as he had in Butte. Now, we're not as geographically vulnerable as Kent is to this issue, so maritime border control would be simpler. I'm sure that if Scotland joined the EU, we'd have to accommodate our fair share of asylum seekers. But given our geographic separation from mainland EU, it would need a more sophisticated and costly effort if someone was going to try to smuggle them across, likely to be prohibitively expensive. So the great majority of asylum seekers here would have to arrive through legitimate means, affording us more control. Now, Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove and others recently defended Dominic Cummings by saying the words to the effect that he acted as any responsible parent would to protect the welfare of his child. Well, someone willing to attempt the English Channel crossing in a dinghy has much bigger problems than Dominic Cummings allegedly had. It is far more deserving of our understanding. Scotland has already shown it is the most inclusive and tolerant part of the UK. I have no doubt that the Scottish asylum system would be more compassionate and welcoming, whilst our borders would be more secure. Folks, thanks for watching. Please comment on the Facebook page. Keep it civil at all times. DaviePHD.